Hey everyone, welcome to the Veritas podcast. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Zach Elliott. Zach is an author and commentator focusing on biological sex differences, something I really like to talk about, and I know he does too. So I'm excited to be speaking with him today. Zach, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me once again.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. I know we had you last fall or summer on the show. That
Yeah,
was a
last
great
fall, I think, or
conversation.
summer. Yeah, I really
Yeah,
enjoyed that.
Yeah, no, it's good to have you back. And this is something that has only become more relevant with time, as I think was predictable, especially
I know
considering
things have
that,
gotten even crazier now
yes,
than we last
yes,
talked. Yeah.
with Biden in
Oh
office,
yeah.
and we'll get into it a little bit,
Hmm.
biological sex differences still a thing, biological sex denialism still very much a thing. But
Despite people's attempts to deconstruct it, it is still a thing. It still exists.
yes,
Males
it's
and
still
females are
there.
still real things that exist out in the world, irrespective of our naming conventions.
Exactly.
They're real things.
But to get us started real quick, I just wanted to ask you to sort of briefly introduce yourself to the audience. Doesn't have to be too detailed. I will mention to anyone watching, if you really want to learn more about Zach specifically, you can always look him up on Twitter. Zach, what's your Twitter handle again?
My Twitter is at ZAE Lefty, Lefty.
Great. And then, yeah, you could, he'll plug his books later and you could do all that. There's also a previous conversation with Zach, as we mentioned, on this channel, and that's going to be linked in the description. So we'll keep his intro relatively brief, Zach, if you'd like. And if anyone really wants to know more about Zach specifically, go ahead and refer yourself to the conversation in the description below. Also, in the description below will be all of Zach's social media and a link to his books. But Zach, if you want to just tell us a little bit about you and what you're about.
Yeah, so around 2017, I started getting really interested in sex differences and specifically just differences between males and females, differences within males and females. So understanding how differences on not just the biological level manifest, but also the psychological level and the social level. And weirdly enough, it was during my architecture school that I started getting interested in this. And I was taking a class on sociology of gender around that time. And they were saying that even sex, male and female, was socially constructed. And so that really piqued my interest even more. And I wanted to know, like, why are you guys saying this? What evidence do you guys have? And so I went up doing a ton of research, ton of writing as well. And um, then in 2019, I wound up writing a full-length book on sex differences. It was called The Gender Paradox, and it was exploring the biological, psychological, and sociological differences between males and females, uh, and then how that manifested in the culture, and then also understanding why there's this ideology right now of saying that males and females are just socially constructed categories. And then in 2020, I started a YouTube channel called the Paradox Institute, and that focus was on using animation and quick 5-minute videos to educate people about these basic topics
Yeah.
regarding sex and gender. And from there, I've gained a lot of followers now, also gained a lot of really interesting perspectives from a ton of people all around the world, and it's been so meaningful to be able to uh, share the importance of biological reality and help other people understand the basics of this stuff.
Yeah, this issue of sort of biological sex denialism, the creep of this ideology that says that sex is completely mutable or changeable, that you can transition from one to the other, that you can somehow change your biology, or the implication of that, is one of the things that kind of was a big part of my political awakening a few years ago. And I think it's led to a lot of people becoming concerned over issues of freedom of speech and things like that. So it's good to speak to someone like you who actually has a very, very acute understanding of biology specifically. And I want to ask you to kind of move us along and get us started on kind of the conversation as it is. Talk to us a little bit about just what exactly is, because a lot of people actually don't
Mhm.
know what exactly is biological sex and the differences between men and women biologically, and how does that differ from these concepts of gender and gender identity that we're hearing so much about?
So you'll hear that people, especially coming from the those who are saying that sex is socially constructed, they'll say that sex is simply a mix of characteristics. They'll say it's a mix of hormones, gonads, genitals, your chromosomes, and they'll say that this can all exist on a spectrum, And whereas gender is something that is socially constructed, something that that different cultures view, like the attitudes of the sexes differently, the expressions of the sexes differently, and your role as a male or female differently. But actually, sex is not just a mix of characteristics. To say it's a mix of characteristics is a category error, because you're not hitting the mark, the bullseye of what sex actually is. And so if we trace those characteristics like gonads, hormones, genitals, chromosomes, all the way back, we can find that there is one fundamental definition of sexes, male and female, and that's focused on what's called a reproductive strategy. So sexes are reproductive strategies, which are evolutionary ways of like forming a new individual. And the two strategies are called male and female. And they're called that because there's two different types. One strategy is the male strategy that involves producing many small motile gametes. And then the other strategy is the female strategy, and that involves producing many large sessile gametes. And the small gametes have not as much material resources for the zygote. They have half the genetic material, but then the large gametes provide a ton of the resources for the developing fetus. And so it's that difference both in gamete size and the difference in gamete number that really is fundamental in defining the sexes. And so from that difference in those reproductive cells comes the many differences that we think of when we think of male and female. Males have a penis, testes, females have vagina, ovaries, that kind of thing. So all those differences in the body ultimately can be traced back to those differences in reproductive strategy that we call male and female.
And
it's an ultimate definition of sex because you can trace it all the way back to 1.2 billion years in the past. And that definition also applies to all of these species that reproduce through those two differently sized gametes. And so that's the beautiful thing of understanding what sexes fundamentally are. You get this broad, universal understanding.
Yeah, it's beyond primordial. It's been around for, as you said, millions and millions of years in species long before human beings. It is binary in mammals specifically, including human beings, and it's.
And I want to mention that binary word that people will, I think, create a straw man of that, because they'll say that, oh, binary just means that all these males have to look just alike and all these females have to just look just alike. There can't be any variation between the two. You can't have any overlap of any traits. It's just totally black and white. And that's what the activists argue that people who are proponents of the sex spectrum think. But in reality, what binary simply means is just a dual system, a system of two states. And so even across animals who are hermaphrodites, who have both male and female functions, like slugs, they're hermaphrodites. They have both male and female reproductive strategies in one individual. That's still binary because it's just a system with two states. And then in mammals are species that have just separate male and female sexes. So the sexes are not in the same individual. They're represented in separate individuals. Some are only males, and the others are only females. And so, yeah, that's what's binary. Yeah.
Right. And as you said, that binary concept does not in any way prevent people from expressing sexuality or presenting themselves in different ways. So I think this is where you get into a really interesting sort of language conflict, sort of a misunderstanding of language that I think is key to this conversation, which is there's male and female, and then there's masculine and feminine. It's entirely possible to any reasonable person that a biological female would present themselves or act in a way that is considered masculine, or that is masculine according to certain mating strategies. Maybe they will present themselves as a big buff woman, and that wouldn't necessarily fit in with traditional female mating strategies as being sort of I don't know, beautiful in the way that a flower is, delicate,
Right,
but
right,
it's, and a man might do the opposite, might present as feminine. And that whether or not that's socially acceptable is a related issue, but a separate issue. At the end of the day, there's a
right.
scientific fact between whether or not people are male or female. So when I mentioned the language issue, this is something I really want to talk to you about. I was thinking about it today
Hmm.
as I prepared for the interview, is it seems that people saying, because the phrase that you'll hear from queer activists or trans activists is I identify as, and they'll say, I identify as male or female, man or woman. And I think that if we just made a very simple switch to saying, well, to be really precise, what you're saying is that you identify as masculine or feminine. You are a man or a woman. You can't identify as a man or a woman necessarily, although I do want to hear your opinion on this. So what do you think of this idea that if we just sort of made this switch in the language that we use, it could sort of maybe create a bridge between the people who think so differently on this topic? If we make it so that instead of people saying, basically they can still say that they identify a certain way, because this is very important to people, sort of getting into the more political aspect of this
Right. So
issue.
they
I
want
know
to
we
be
started with the
seen, and they
science.
want to be seen in a
Yes,
certain
it's that,
way
and
and
and you
perceived in a certain way.
and you
Yeah.
give them that opportunity by saying, why don't you just say that you identify as masculine, that you present as masculine, that you are, you could even say, I am masculine. That's not necessarily
Hmm.
untrue. That doesn't deny anything scientifically per se, but to say that you're male or female specifically, or that you are a man or a woman specifically, is where we get into a situation where we have a brewing battle over biological males competing in sports for women.
Yeah, the activists will say that sex and gender are distinct, completely separate, which in some sense they really are distinct things. Sex is a reproductive strategy, and then how your body is then organized around that reproductive strategy of male or female. And then gender is something that, like you said, is really about masculine and feminine traits that exist on average on a spectrum, and that people, males and females, can manifest those traits differently and in different forms, but that doesn't actually change their sex. If they're, let's say, a really masculine woman acting in a way that's not typical of her sex, but she's still female. And I think it would help a lot to kind of go back to the understanding of what man and woman are and what male and female are. I don't really see that you can detach male and female from man and woman necessarily. I understand their argument that, oh, man and woman are genders and that we can detach them completely from male and female. But that makes man and woman complete social constructs, and it makes man and woman something that is completely
Meaningless.
culturally
It makes
and,
them meaningless.
yeah, totally meaningless, defined by culture, defined by time. And when people identify as a man or woman, and they say they identify that way, we always have to ask, well, what does that mean? And so when we try to ask what that means to them, oftentimes we get responses, well, I just identify as a woman because I am a woman. Or, it's like, it's just a
It's
circular
circular. Yeah.
logic, and it doesn't really get us anywhere. We might ask, what makes you identify as a woman? What's the definition of a woman? And they'll often list out these very stereotypically feminine traits. And so they're conflating sex and gender because they're saying that, oh, the category I am is woman, but in reality they're male, but they're presenting in a stereotypically feminine way, or a typically feminine way, or a way that they see is feminine in their own eyes. And so it's entirely subjective in my mind. I don't think there's any foundation for what a man and woman are outside of biology. Of course, there's tons of social aspects that inform being a man or woman. There's many layers to that socially. But underneath all that, at the bottom, is the biology. And
Well,
yeah.
that's the thing, though, is that we've identified, there's these supposedly separate concepts of sex and gender. And this is always kind of brought in as kind of the position to make it all seem reasonable, is like, oh, wait, we're not actually denying sex. We're saying that there's this thing called gender, which is, how somebody feels or identifies. But then they go into spaces where what really matters isn't how someone feels or identifies. What really matters is someone's biology, most notably in the sports category, because you actually have people physically interacting, sometimes in contact sports, where be a biological male, and sometimes in combat sports, actually, a biological male facing a biological woman in a combat sport is an inherently awful idea to any reasonable person. And so it seems, I want to ask you about the term gender, actually, because it seems like gender is almost kind of introduced into conversations in a way that obfuscates everything, because it ends up, it's almost like it can kind of be whatever people want it to be, because one second it's used to moderate the position and say, oh, no, we're transgender. We're not saying you can change sexes per se, but then you get into categories. I mean, you get into somebody's, there's this whole thing about your photo ID where it says sex. Should you be able to put something there that a doctor probably wouldn't put? And a lot of people say yes. It seems like gender and gender identity are terms that they're not particularly useful because they can be used for whatever the hell people want to use them for. So how do you feel about those terms where biological sex is the thing you're familiar with and it's scientifically based, but gender and gender identity, I've always wondered, how useful are those terms even?
Yeah, there's three main definitions. You have gender, which is this kind of overarching concept about how cultures across time and space define males and females in terms of their clothing and how they express themselves and the roles that they think males and females should have in those societies. So that's kind of gender in the broad sense. And then gender expression is kind of often defined as this masculine and feminine spectrum of how you express yourself socially, by the clothes you wear, by the things you're interested in, and how you interact with others and your behavior. And then there's gender identity, which is this category rather than a spectrum, but they say it's a spectrum at the same time. So in one sense, they're saying that I have this gender identity that's a category, which is my internal sense of self, of who I am. And then they also say that these gender identities can be infinite, that they can exist on a spectrum. That there's also what they call binary gender identities, which are man-woman, and then non-binary identities, which are opposite of man and woman, like non-binary or something outside of man.
You can be gender fluid. You can switch.
Gender fluid, yeah. And so there's all these definitions that really, really confuse things, and especially gender identity has been a very interesting thing to see explored. It's because there's a lot of different ways that activists will try to validate, so to speak, the existence of gender identity. They'll say that, for one thing, they'll look at brain research and talk about how there's these differences on average within male brains, or males' brains and females' brains. And then they'll point out that some research shows that trans individuals have some brain structures that look more similar to those of the opposite sex. And when I look at that research, there's a few things that pop out at me. One is there's probably some confounding variables. One of the variables is, well, sexuality. A person's sexuality, being heterosexual or homosexual, can also impact brain differences. It can be a driving force of brain differences, or at least the other way around. And so, like, for instance, gay men and gay women, there's evidence that some of their brain structures are more similar to those of the opposite sex too. So the question is, what brain structures are different? How do they manifest? And then the second one is also, I don't think you'll ever be able to find gender identity, because if it does exist, it's going to be something that's an emergent phenomenon of multiple networks in the brain interacting together. So you're not going to be able to just drill down and find, oh, this is the spot where gender identity is. I don't think you'll be able to find that for sexuality either. But the difference between sexuality and gender identity is that, in one sense, sexuality is something that you express through your behavior, whereas gender identity is more of an internal, subjective sense of self. It's much more subjective, and it's rather ill-defined. And as long as activists are not able to clearly define gender identity, I don't think it's going to continue to work for them long term. I mean, it's kind of a belief system because it's so subjective and it's so set on how I view myself internally that I really think that it's just, people should just treat it as a belief system. It's something that you can live out if you see fit. But at the same time, I, as a person, don't have to go along with that belief system if I don't want to. So there's this balance there. But then, I guess going back to gender expression, that's often what I focus on when I'm talking about gender, is the masculine and feminine spectrum. And I would define masculine and feminine as masculine traits are traits that are most typically seen in males on average, and then females can express them too. And then feminine traits are traits that are more often seen in females on average, but then males can also express them too. So you get that gender expression, that gender spectrum that way. And I think that's a more like realistic
it's kind of what I said before. It almost seems like I'm glad you pointed out that there's so many different versions of gender that are kind of introduced, whether it's via the gender unicorn for anyone that's seen that or anything like that.
Yeah.
Where, you know, there's this expression, this identity, just the word gender. It seems like expression is the closest, is almost identical to what I was saying before about it's just masculine, feminine. And the word expression, I actually don't mind because it doesn't really set up for anything particularly authoritarian. I mean, it's sort of in the name. It's like if you were to ask somebody to reinforce your expression, that's inherently authoritarian. It's right there. Whereas with identity, people seem to take it much more seriously, or gender. It seems like we don't need to have all these terms. And the reason there are so many of them is almost to intentionally make it confusing, because it ends up being very confusing. The fact that there is gender identity, gender expression, gender, it's almost like there's sort of a have your cake and eat it too situation where there's a certain amount of legitimacy that they want it to have, but they also want it to be nebulous enough that it can kind of be anything at any time. And I think a great example of that is the brain scans that you were bringing up. And I'll elaborate by saying, the brain scan thing is fascinating to me because it suggests, and this is really compelling and interesting, it suggests that there's a physiological or psychological basis, like a scientific basis for transsexuality or transgenderism. And that's really interesting. It's compelling to anyone who's an honest debater on this topic to say, oh, you're actually suggesting some kind of scientific basis for this. But then as you think about it, you'll realize that what it suggests is that whether or not someone is quote unquote truly trans might be based on their brain chemistry, right? That's the ultimate conclusion that you're going to reach. And if you actually take it that far, and most people who are self-described queer activists or trans activists, they're not going to like it very much because it ends up putting people into the category of, you know, the joke name for it a few years ago was Transgender, somebody who's kind of jumping on the bandwagon. Abigail Shrier has done great work in kind of talking about how a lot of young women are suddenly identifying as boys under kind of dubious circumstances. And it really would illuminate the fact that you might have that category because you're saying, you could look in someone's brain and see, do they have a sort of quote unquote female brain in a male body or vice versa? And I guarantee you, if you brought it to them and said, okay, well, the compromise is we will accept people as what they identify based on this brain scan, they would hate that. It's like that would not be just knowing kind of how these people operate. It has to be this 100%. It's how I identify. It would
exclude them from that category.
Right. It would exclude a lot of people.
Some of them, a lot of them,
yeah. I mean, who knows the exact proportion, right? Who would, if you did a brain scan of all, you know, trans identifying people or whatever, who would fall into that category or not? And I know there's a limited amount of research in this area, but if you kind of played it out, there's a very much a have your cake and eat it too situation where they want it to be this thing where it's I identify what I believe has to be what is reinforced by society and by other people. And then they go into this kind of scientific route, which is really compelling. When I first heard that, I was like, oh, this is actually really interesting. But if you take it to its logical conclusion, it ends up in a place where I don't think anyone's going to be satisfied, including them.
They want it to be both biological and completely socially constructed at the same time.
They sort of want the credibility of science, and but then not the sort of the rules that come along with science, which is, well, eventually you're going to reach a conclusion that you may not like.
Right. That your identity is not actually validated.
It's a physical brain situation. Yeah, exactly. Right. It's not something that you can just turn on and off. I mean, the gender fluid thing is the most extreme example, because that's, for anyone that doesn't know, where you could literally switch your gender over the course of a few days or even just a few hours. It's not practiced a lot, as I understand it. Most people will never meet someone, at least currently in the world, who identifies as gender fluid.
But when it gets to that level, I think it's just really like it's almost like personality expression. Yeah, it's something that's individual to them and really unique to them, and they want the world to see them in a certain way. And it is kind of like personality, because it is a value system in terms of what they value and what they're trying to show to the world in terms of how they present themselves, and like changing even like that, like gender fluid. But I think there's also a big emptiness there, because you're so focused externally on what others think of you. You're so focused on external validation rather than just being secure in yourself for who you are. And if you're so set on just being validated externally by others, you're just going to be a slave to other people.
Well, and it seems like this is a pattern that seems to come up in the kind of culture around queer activism, where everything is very, for lack of a better word, flamboyant. Like everything is very over the top, and it's like, you're going to know if I identify this way. I mean, there's an entire, I don't know what to call it. Let's call it an art form, kind of the drag thing, where it's based on taking the idea of being a woman and almost parodying it. I've actually made some comments in the past about how it's woman face. It's like a sort of bizarre, it's almost like a minstrel show, but of women. It's very bizarre. And I'm not a particularly big fan of it. I understand some people enjoy it a lot. And it's an older art form as well. I know it's been around for several decades, but my point in saying that is that it seems to be this thing where it's like, it's solely based on the idea that you would present in a way that is provocative and unusual, but the substance isn't really there, unless it's something like David Bowie, where there's the actual art form of music is integral to it. And yes, he's sort of cross-dressed as well, but that was just an aesthetic. The thing that was most important about David Bowie was the music. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But there's
that kind of supplements the music.
But it seems like there's a very aesthetic quality to the culture, particularly of queer activism, that sort of it butts heads with some people in the trans community. So somebody like Buck Angel or somebody like Blair White, who are trans activists who, in Blair White's case, she is conservative. Buck Angel, I'm not going to call him conservative because I'm not certain that he is, but in some ways he's not, traditionally left wing, insofar that he doesn't present to the point where I'm even saying he right now, like he just doesn't present in a way that would make you think he's anything other than a typical male.
Calling Buck Angel she.
Exactly. And Blair, totally most people would feel weird calling Blair White he.
Blair,
and it's because they don't take it sort of to 11. I mean, certainly Buck Angel doesn't. Blair White maybe a little bit, but not particularly. And it seems like there's something there about the fact that, because I'm trying to bring it back to the fact that you mentioned, a lot of this seems to be about the way someone is viewed externally and their desire to express something. We don't know exactly what, through the way that they dress and the way that they act. And it seems to get tied up in these political issues, because nobody ever stops it at saying it's
fluid conservative.
Right. Yeah. No, well, nobody ever stops it at saying like it's an art form. It's a form of play. Right, like for a while, drag was a thing where it was explicitly a form of play. It was something fun and kind of a sideshow. Whereas now we're asked to celebrate it and reinforce it to the point where you could have a biological male who has done little other than dress as a woman and put
Hmm.
on makeup like a woman, who says, I want to lift weights in the women's competition, and just do that
Right.
based on this aesthetic aspect.
Right.
It's all just very odd. And it wasn't really a thing until maybe
Yeah. We
2016. Like, it's very new that people
we
take
had
this as seriously as they do.
we've always had, in cultures, we've always had different movements that were focused on expressing yourself in a different way through an aesthetic. I mean, like people who were goth,
Yeah.
I mean, there's just
Yeah.
different ways of expressing yourself that way. But they never, people that express themselves in these atypical ways through their clothes or behavior or interests, they never tried to, or for the most part, didn't try to force it onto other
It
people
did
and
not
didn't
become a
try to
political
legislate it into
movement.
law
Yeah.
as something that you're compelled to go along
Now
with.
I'm imagining a goth political movement. It's
Yeah.
hilarious.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's 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 really destructive when it's taken to that extreme because it's infringing on people's rights to see themselves as see themselves and others as the way they want is being infringed upon. And also, of course, as we talked about, the really important physical issues like sports, females, their rights are being infringed upon by males who want to compete in their category despite immense physical advantages. And and then when you get into things like changing rooms and things like that, I mean, there's all these barriers that start to be violated when you deconstruct that category of sex, male and female, completely, and then try to replace it with something as subjective as gender identity. And it's really, really bad for our culture and for people's health and safety and rights. It's horrible.
Yeah, I like the idea. I'm glad you brought up the goth thing and how there are these movements which are really heavily based on aesthetics, which appeal to younger people, which sort of communicate something vaguely political, like the goth thing, the punk thing. They're all supposed to be
Mm-hmm.
rebellious. They're all supposed to be about fuck the man, about fuck the establishment, what we're told to
Mm-hmm.
believe as young people that may turn out not to be true. But there seems to be a hard limit on how far those things were allowed to go. There was never legislation introduced on behalf of the goth community or the punk community,
Right.
really. Those people all grew up, took off their makeup. Sorry, there's a siren passing. All right, there it goes.
Good.
So those people all grew up at one point and they kind of took off the makeup and put on a suit, and let's say their political opinions, their ideas matured, right? If you were a punk, you might have grown up to be a rebellious member of US Congress. Like, it's Bernie Sanders. I don't know that he was a punk when he was a kid, but he certainly was. Oh, sorry. We have a lot
You're
of
good.
emergencies here today, apparently. Some ambulances passing by. All of this is to say, it seems like these other movements sort of acted like what they are, which is a phase in someone's life where they're expressing a general anti-authoritarian sentiment in a way that has evolved over time. At one point, it was hippie. At one point, it was punk. At one point, it was goth. And eventually, they become an adult, and they sort of start to go along with more traditional conventions aesthetically, and their beliefs
Right. And even
mature into something more specific than just fuck the man. Whereas this
right.
seems to be a movement that's built around fuck the gender, the sexual binary or whatever it is, fuck these things, which, yeah, maybe there is a conversation to be had about the rigid standards we place on people in terms of how they express themselves. But
I
it's
totally
taken to
agree.
the point of, right, but it's taken to the point of being so incredibly self-serious and so authoritarian in nature, because it never matures beyond this point of just this very kind of chaotic teenage mindset of whatever I want to do, however I want to dress and act or do, whether it's compete in a sport that maybe I shouldn't be competing in or whatever it is, I should be able to do it. It has this sort of adolescent mindset that never seems to go away.
Yeah, exactly. There's all those movements that you talked about. People, even if they still uh, related to those things and still wanted to behave or dress in a certain way, they still went on and lived their lives fully, and they didn't necessarily expect that everybody conformed to their
No.
belief system and their style of dress and that kind of thing. And that is the one huge difference with this gender movement as opposed to these different movements, is that there's this political ideology that it's actually founded on that political ideology. It's it's at its core something political, because you're trying to dismantle this oppressive power structure that they call the sex binary, or in the gender binary too. And they think that this is somehow going to lead to this liberation where everybody can just express themselves as anything they want at all times, and that there's no consequences for that, or no fallout from, let's say, infringing on people's rights, like trying to compete with females in a boxing match as a male.
Yeah. Or
And
their right to express what they believe to be true. For instance, if I were to use the pronoun he on Caitlyn Jenner, I might do that because I believe he is male. But, that's my right to do that, but they might infringe on that as well.
Right. As we've seen legislation being passed definitely in Canada, and some are trying to pass it in the UK too, where compelling you to say those pronouns in the way that the activists want you to say them, and not letting you decide for yourself how you want to express yourself, what words you want to use. In my mind, you should not give the government the power to tell you what you have to say. It's one thing having the government tell you what not to say, like, oh, you can't say this, but it's a totally different thing when the government is telling you, compelling you to say something specific, basically endorsing this worldview, this different worldview that not everybody is going to agree with.
Yeah.
It is like enforcing a state religion on people.
Yes, it is religious and it's political. And I want to hone in on the fact that there's something different about this movement than maybe somewhat similar movements in the past, because what I'm realizing is that when you really get down to it, the goth movement and the punk movement were all kind of about fitting in a social context. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have a kid in 1983. He doesn't fit in with the jocks. He doesn't fit in with the nerds exactly. He needs a place to fit in. And he's depressed, as many teenagers are, in the way that a teenager is. He listens to a certain kind of music, as many teenagers do. And he goes, oh, there's this group that kind of fits in with these conventions that I can fit into basically no matter what I look like, no matter how, what my physical traits are, no matter how good I'm doing in school. If I just put on some makeup and I listen to a lot of Morrissey, I fit into this group. Or if I listen to The Clash, I fit into this group. I can hang out with these people. And then eventually, because these are people who want to do something that we all want to do, it's a very natural instinct to want to fit in. They got either into college or they actually got into the working world at around the age of 21, 22, whatever. And they realized, like, oh, if I want to fit in now, I got to stop doing that because people don't look like Robert Smith. I think that's his name, the lead singer of The Cure.
It might hurt getting a job sometimes.
Right. Yeah. They don't look like that in the office. Yeah. So their natural instinct to fit in kicks in, and they sort of assimilate to whatever culture works in the moment. And this is an inherently cooperative instinct. It's also a little bit of a groupthink instinct. There's definitely a dark side to it.
You kind of have to conform in a good and bad way.
Right.
In a sense.
But the thing is, what you were kind of saying before is this new movement, it sort of seems like it's about fitting in at first. It's about people who want to fit in. But then eventually you realize it seems like they want to actually fundamentally change the space that they're in, not so much fit in. Because again, because there are these scientifically dubious aspects to the ideology behind this movement, it just doesn't fit. Like you'll get to certain hard walls, like the sports issue, like the free speech issue, where it just doesn't fit in with our social norms. And then they'll say, okay, change it. Like, instead of there being that kind of take off the makeup moment when you get the job or you go to a college where maybe there aren't a lot of goths or whatever, it seems to get to a point where you realize it's not fundamentally about fitting in. It's about making everybody conform to your fit.
Yeah, exactly. That's totally what I've seen too. And I think going back to its roots, it's always been about that. If we look back at the theory of queer theory, which is a formal theory underneath this activism regarding deconstructing sex and gender, they always started with the premise, first, that gender is a social construct, and that we need to get past these roles that males and females are supposedly be in. Whether it's, for example, oh, the woman in this relationship has to stay home and take care of the child. That's a stereotypical role that females were often relegated to. And so that was the kind of gender aspect that at least the radical feminists were focusing on deconstructing, and allowing people the freedom of choice to live their lives as males and females. And then after the radical feminism movement kind of sprang up, then you also get this twist of this queer theory start to grow in the 80s and 90s, with people writing like Judith Butler, like there's a few other ones, but mainly Judith Butler. Gail Rubin is one also. And so they're writing, and they take the radical feminist position that gender is a social construct, and that we need to liberate people from those roles, but then they go a step further. And this step is the rejection of the radical feminist position that sex is an objective, critical category that we have to define clearly if we want to liberate women from oppression. The queer theorists take that and they say, no, if we want liberation, sex also has to be deconstructed. We have to view sex as a social construct. And so that's when they start writing things like, there are not two kinds of distinguishable male and female bodies in the world, which is a quote from a professor of sociology, Robin Ryle, in her textbook, Questioning Gender. And it's like, well, what? You're talking about sex here. You started off this whole book by talking about how sex is a social construct. You're supposedly talking about gender here. So they go way further. And so Judith Butler also wrote that perhaps sex is not as culturally constructed as gender. Perhaps it was already gender. She said perhaps the distinction between sex and gender is no distinction at all. And so this is the foundation of their movement, is this deconstruction of gender and sex. And then taking that into the mainstream, training activists to understand this belief system and then put it into practice on both the social level and the legislative level. And so it's completely ideological, going back all the way to that theory in the 80s and 90s. It's not something that just arose naturally over time, like something like the Goth movement did, or people in the 60s, hippies going to Woodstock. These things arose naturally. But queer theory and this whole movement did not arise naturally at all. It arose naturally in the sense that there was all types of communication and education and teaching people about these ideas. And then those people who were taught those ideas then spread them to other places, to other universities, to other institutions. I mean, that was kind of natural in the sense of how it spread, but it wasn't natural in terms of how it was created. It wasn't formed from the bottom up. It was formed from the top down by these academic philosophers.
Yeah, it seems to come from this family of critical studies, whether it's critical race studies or critical gender studies, that are inherently based on breaking down society and changing it fundamentally, because it is something that they claim is rotten, that they claim is awful. And if you, this is sort of getting into a whole nother level of things. This is something that I know Jordan Peterson's talked about many times. If you look at our society as it is in a historical context, you go back thousands of years and look at the societies that have existed. We live in an incredible society, a society that is, for all of its faults, much more just and certainly much more peaceful. I mean, think about the level of violence that we have now in the world compared to the level of violence 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. That this ideology comes from this family of ideologies, of studies, that they want to change society. And the only reason to want to change society is because it's something so incredibly awful that you have to fundamentally change it from the top down. And yet an honest person looking at our society should look at it more as it's pretty damn good. And we've got to, file around the edges, cross our T's and dot our I's. That's a more reasonable way to look at a society
Improve
that operates
where we can,
yes,
build upon what we have. Yeah.
And that's not the idea. The idea of these theories and studies is, no, that's not acceptable. And we hear this in the rhetoric that is used. We hear it, when people are saying, let's not just open up how people can express themselves. Let's take down, the sexual binary entirely. But we especially hear it with the Black Lives Matter thing. It comes up over and over again because it's, reform is not good enough, abolish, right? It's like things are always kind of taken to this new step of they call it fundamental change, which sounds nice. It sounds like something from the Obama '08 campaign, hope and change, right? But really,
So we're going to fundamentally change America.
Right, which requires destruction. And that's the element of these things. Is we need to tear something down. Exactly. And that's the scary thing that people don't pick up on. I want to ask you, sort of on this note, how well educated do you think people are on these issues and on the factions at play? Like, do people know the forces behind this? Do they know what it is? Because I feel like there's been a really effective marketing strategy to make this just a civil rights issue. It's just the new, like, either you're the woman from that photo who's screaming at the black lady trying to go to school, or you're the black lady, right? It's like you have to identify with one of these two groups. You know which one you want to identify with. And there's been a really effective marketing strategy to make it that way. And of course, nobody wants to be the white lady screaming. Nobody wants to do that. Yeah. We don't want to do that either. Nobody wants to be that person. But it's just not that, no pun intended, black and white. Like it's at the end of the day, how poorly educated do you? I don't think you're going to say people are well educated on this topic. I mean, where do you think the general population is at with their understanding of what's actually going on here?
I think the general population, I'd say a few years ago, pretty much nobody really knew what was going on. I think it's more people have peaked, so to speak, in terms of kind of getting familiar now with what's going on and kind of questioning this continual push for remaking society, because it's really popping up now more, especially since 2020. That it's kind of exposed itself even more, all these critical ideologies, but I don't think most people really have a good grasp of what's going on. And if they do, they usually don't have a good grasp of the theories behind it either. That's why I loved the book Cynical Theories with James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose.
Yeah.
That was excellent for that, because it really helped people. It was like a Rosetta Stone for telling people how to understand and interpret these ideologies, where they come from, what they are. And I thought that was just excellent. So we need more stuff like that to really educate people about it. I also think that people generally, we often think that people are too closed-minded for their own good. But I really think a lot of times people can be, especially in this era, too open-minded, in the sense that they're too receptive to novel information, where they're so receptive and open-minded to new ideas and to this constant push that their brains fall out. They lose their critical thinking skills. Yeah, they have no skepticism. Yeah, and you have to have a healthy sense of skepticism if you want to keep a healthy open mind. If you're so open-minded that you lose your skepticism and you lose your critical thinking skills, you become closed-minded in a sense, in that you're not really critically evaluating the ideas you're just imbibing, and that can be super destructive when people do that, because they're not knowingly doing that, they're just not aware. And that's how a lot of people get on this social justice train, is that they think that they're following this continuation of the civil rights era, when it's not really the continuation of the civil rights era. It took a detour somewhere else. It's far away from the civil rights era now. It's totally not the same thing at all. And people definitely need to educate themselves and be more aware, and be curious and be open that way, and not just take things at face value from these institutions that we've seen, like, for example, Scientific American, famous pop science magazine, writing that sex is on a spectrum, that it's transphobic to say that sex is binary, that you're a bad person if you believe that sex is binary, and all that stuff. And using those emotions, people that don't use their critical thinking skills are going to think that, oh, I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. I want to be on the right side of history.
And
I
there's
want to
no
believe,
skepticism. They don't say, why is this person telling me this? Because
yeah,
anytime somebody tells you that you're a bad person if you don't do something, there should be a little bit of skepticism, unless it's very obvious. If they're talking about murder or rape or something like that, it's very obvious why it's bad to do it. But if somebody tells you that it's bad to do something and it's not immediately obvious to you why it's actually bad to do it, and 5 years ago, if you told most people it's bad to call someone the pronoun that you think they are, like, or something like that, or to say it's bad for there to be men and women's sports based on biology, people would have been like, I mean, there'd be something in their head that goes like, well, why? But then the thing is, it's sold with such ferocity as like, you're a bad person. Don't think about it. You're a bad person if you think about it. Like even thinking about, even asking questions becomes supposedly something that makes you on the wrong side of history.
they use two strategies. They appeal to people's knowledge, like sense of wanting to learn something that's important, that's new and novel, and then also people's morality, sense of morality, saying that if you don't believe this, you're a bad person, or if you do believe this, you're enlightened, you're the educated moral one. And they use those two strategies by using people's credentials for one thing, and using the weight of their and the power of their institutions, like Scientific American, like Nature, like some of these other media organizations and biological journals and stuff like that. They use those things as tools to appeal to people's knowledge, so people feel like they're up to date on the recent science. And then they also appeal to people's morality that way by saying, if you don't agree to that updated science, you're not a good person, you're a transphobe, intersex phobe, all these buzzwords as used as moral cudgels to try and get you to feel bad about your position, or even kind of get you to do that to others too, to view other people who,
well, they
think that,
incentivize you to do that. So they say, if you do that
they
to others,
incentivize it.
you're a good soldier, right? You're one of, like, there are actually incentives to do that, especially if you're part of the Democratic Party apparatus or the media apparatus. All of a sudden, you're better at what you do if you're doing this thing, this cancel culture thing. If you're part of that mob,
Right.
it's not actually a bad thing to be a part of this mob. If you're a part of
Right.
that mob, you
It's
get
just
free
you
brownie
enacting
points.
the consequences of that person's quote unquote immoral statement.
Yeah.
You know, you're enacting those consequences. They'll often say that it's not cancel culture, it's consequence culture.
Yeah. It's
I'm
like,
like,
you
oh
are
my
the law.
God.
Apparently, you're supposed to be the one who decides what this person deserves based on the information you have, which comes from surely a great source, which has not put anything out of context.
See, for example, the famous Scientific American blog article, "Stop Using Phony Science to Justify Transphobia," that one is written by a PhD graduate student in neuroscience who is also a trans person. So see, conflict of interest there, likely.
I mean, yeah.
And yeah, and so they paint things in a way where they'll present real research, real scientific research from these journals that is absolutely true, and they'll present that, but then they'll twist it and they'll twist its findings. They'll say like, oh, look at all these different ways that males and females can develop. I'm going to cite this research that shows, oh, the SRY gene is not always the sex-determining factor for males. Sometimes that SRY gene moves onto an X chromosome, and you get a male who has XX chromosomes. And they're like, see, sex is not binary. Transgender people are real. It's like those two things are not the same thing at all.
But they're using sciencey words, and so most people don't have the capacity to. Again, it's the lack of skepticism of things that sound like. I feel like the time has almost passed where people are just so accepting of these things because they just kind of have a trigger in their head where if it has kind of like this pro marginalized group bent to it, it must be true. But that wasn't always the case, and people, I think, had this minimal skepticism at first that, like you said, it was just cudgeled out of them, using kind of the mythology of the civil rights movement as a context for it, of like, well, who do you want to be? Do you want to be the X-phobe, the phobe, I always think of that image that they show you in school. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Of that woman screaming. They're trying to integrate schools in Alabama, I think, and the National Guard is there to lead this young black girl. She must be 18 or 19 or something. She's trying to go to school, to college. And there's this woman barking at her, this white woman who just looks so furious that the schools are being integrated. And that image, it was shown to me, and I assume it was shown to you, to show the level of racism. I mean, that woman has become a symbol of, Jim Crow racism. And I feel like constantly we are being asked which of those two sides we want to be. And that's all there is to it.
Right.
There's no room for discussion. They want it. And they want it to be that black and white.
It's because they paint it as the continuation of the civil rights era.
Yeah.
And they paint it with that level of heaviness and moral weight. And so if you disagree with it, you must be just like that white lady in Alabama yelling at the black girl that's trying to go to school.
Yeah. And that's something that everyone inherently understands. You were shown that when you were in school. I was shown that when I was in school. They picked such a good mythology to use. And by the way, when I say mythology, obviously the civil rights movement was a very real thing with real goals.
Right.
But I say mythology because there is kind of a romanticized version of it in our heads, right? How many movies have we watched where somebody is heroically, whatever. I mean, especially these. Yeah, exactly. There's romanticized versions of this, which have their virtues. Some of these are good movies or good books or whatever, but some of them are pandering. Many of them are just romanticized and dramatic in the way that much media is. But at the end of the day, there's something deep in the brains, I think, of particularly millennials, Gen Xers, and I don't know to what extent Gen Zers. You're Gen Z, actually. I realize, because you're a little bit younger than me. I'm sort of on the line between Gen Z and millennial. But it sounds like at the very least we had a somewhat similar experience to where the civil rights movement was really kind of taught to people as it was kind of given to people as a context for morality of like the bad people are these bigots. The good people are for whatever is the marginalized community. Obviously it was black people. And so, this kind of bleeds into the gay rights movement with, in my opinion, relatively minimal damage. I'm for same-sex marriage and things like that. But now it bleeds into something else that it doesn't make as much sense. And it asks of us so much more than the civil rights movement ever asked of us.
Right. Because like, for instance, people who were fighting for gay rights were mostly fighting for the freedom to live their lives as they saw fit, but also while not infringing on other people's rights.
They asked nothing of others.
Yeah, they recognized that they just wanted to be able to live their life without getting infringed upon by the government, and then allowed at the same time people to disagree with them. And for the most part, I felt like it was much more open and less focused on making people conform. It was much more liberal in the true sense of being open to ideas, being open to ideas that are different from your own, and wanting to talk with people who differ with you and be open that way. Whereas this ideology is wanting everybody to conform and wanting everybody to have the same viewpoint on things. And if you don't, you're castigated as someone who's morally reprehensible. And the weight it has on people is so strong, because people are just not aware. And like we said, people just often don't know any better. They just think it's a continuation of the civil rights movement.
Well, and they're very afraid. Like, they really don't want to be in the bad group. Like that, that's part of, we can go back to cancel culture, because the consequence for that has been advertised very effectively. It's
lose your job. Yeah. Your
bad
way
stuff.
of income. Really bad. You get ostracized by your entire community.
Yeah.
Lose your friends, maybe.
Yeah. It's sort of on this note. I mean, what do you think are the potential positive developments that could come over the course of the next few years? I think that there's sort of an opportunity in that, with Trump having left office and Joe Biden having come into office, Joe Biden being elected president, there's now, I feel like that now there's a certain degree of accountability on this topic, because the president of the United States is now enacting some of these policies. They're going to go into effect, and there's going to be a result. And we're going to see those results. And I think, especially when it comes to sports, especially combat sports, again, we're going to see some interesting things.
I think that administration is probably playing their cards. So playing their cards maybe too much, where they kind of pique people, so to speak, to the actual reality of what's going on, or make people really kind of interested, like, oh wait, what? Seems a little too far.
Yeah.
Or this doesn't seem genuine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and also there's, for a while, I feel like the whole conversation over all of these issues, it just, Trump was so in the way because everything just became like, it's Trump or it's not Trump. He's gone, and he'll be gone hopefully for the foreseeable future. I don't want him back.
People
but
were painted as if you agreed with something
that is vaguely
that was vaguely related,
anti-woke.
or yeah, vaguely anti-woke. Yeah.
Yeah.
That
All of a
you're a Trump
sudden you're
supporter.
Trump, and it's just like, oh
Yeah.
God damn it. Because people are very binary in their thinking when it comes to
Right.
politics. But now we have an incumbent administration. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's an opportunity to play offense if you are critical of these things,
Sure.
as we are,
Mhm.
because the establishment is, whether it's the corporations, whether it's the media, and now the federal government, they're going to be on defense. They have to defend their actions because they're in control of everything.
Mhm.
And they're going to, especially on the government level, there's going to be real actual policies that are put into place. And, these are going to become legislative issues. For a while, the general thing on this that people would tell me is like, why do you care so much about these culture war issues? They don't manifest in any meaningful way. Where they're about to.
Mhm.
They are now.
Yeah.
Especially if you're again, I know I keep bringing it up, but a young woman trying to play field hockey or whatever in high school, it's going to come up.
Oh yeah.
And so
It's
do you
starting
feel
to
like
really
there's
impact people's lives now.
Yes.
Yeah.
So do you feel like that's
why.
kind of an opportunity for people like you and I? I generally just refer to it as kind of the heterodox coalition. Or is there an opportunity? Yeah.
It's true.
Maybe a good replacement for the intellectual dark web that
Yeah,
seems
that's
to
what I
have
was
been
thinking too.
ceremoniously put to rest. I'll try to sell that one if I get a conversation with Eric
The
Weinstein at any
heterodox
point.
coalition.
Yeah.
You got the Heterodox Academy, which is run by
Right.
Haidt.
Yeah.
But the heterodox coalition is a good, seems like a good broad
very
term for
inclusive,
that. Yeah.
ironically enough.
It is very inclusive.
And intellectually diverse. But
That's true.
No way to work equity in there. But diversity and inclusion, those can be good. But anyway,
the true sense. Yeah.
Do you think there's sort of this opportunity for, let's say, the heterodox coalition to play offense, to make progress on this issue, where to expose the reality of what's going on, to bring it beyond the point of this romanticized notion of the civil rights movement, things like that?
I think there definitely is. I think that people need to oftentimes set aside differences that are just superficial differences to come together. And if we can set aside just superficial differences in terms of our politics or some of our values, and we can align with an overarching value system in terms of allowing people to have diverse ideas, stopping things like compelled speech legislation from getting passed, and cultivating a culture of free thought, I think that we could go really far. People just need to set aside their superficial differences. I know there's a subset of radical feminists who are also kind of aligned with conservatives in the sense that they're both fighting for sex-based rights when it comes to sports and things like that. I think that's a good example of a powerful alliance of completely different ideological groups that can really bring about change. And one good thing is that I feel like through this whole fight against these critical ideologies that are so divisive and destructive to people's liberty, I think that a lot of us will gain a much greater sense of what's important too in our culture, in our society, the overarching values of our culture. And I think it will let us go back to the roots of our philosophy in terms of just broad liberalism, giving people the rights to express themselves freely, giving people the rights to have diverse viewpoints, not fear getting canceled and stuff like that. I think we can cultivate a much better culture. In some sense, we have to become more accepting of diverse viewpoints, but at the same time, we have to hold our ground against those who want to compel everybody and make everyone conform.
You need to identify bad faith actors. I mean, at the end of the day, I've had struggles with people where I discuss the culture war or whatever you want to call it, and they go like, well, there have to be a bad guy. Like they don't like the use of the terms like war
Yeah,
and battle
right.
and bad guys, good guys,
I,
but it's like somebody's got to be the bad guy. There are some truly malicious actors here. There are some people who they're afraid, they're acting under duress, or they are just, some people are just mentally ill. They've been convinced of absolutely ridiculous things. But there are also truly malicious actors who just at the end of the day, they're the bad guys. And if we're unable to look, they're treating us that like they're going to call us the bad guys, right? And if we're not even able to respond
totally.
by saying no, actually you're the bad guys, if we're going to sit there saying like, oh well, can we have bad guys, like if we're going to have, that's kind of a good metaphor for just the whole intellectual dark web meltdown, is there's these discussions over how we're going to solve this problem that just devolve into a failure to launch, in essence.
See, exactly. That's what I've noticed too. Like the IDW kind of, I felt like kind of fizzled out because I don't think they had this overarching kind of goal or value system that they wanted to kind of go towards. They were focused on kind of their own individual projects still, which that's fine. It's just it didn't turn out to be what some people thought it would be in the long run. And I remember yesterday I was on Twitter and I was looking at what Peter Boghossian, a philosophy professor who has been also writing with James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose about these critical ideologies, and he's been exposing these critical ideologies. He was talking about how he is completely done now with this woke ideology in the broad sense. He is going to wage complete ideological warfare, he said, against this ideology. He's going to have no tolerance for any of it. Now, it doesn't mean hurting people or anything like that. It just means he's going to stand up for his values. He's not going to let the ground be taken further. He's not going to let any inch of ground be taken. He's going to start standing up for that and not apologizing for anything, not placating anyone, just completely standing up for his values with courage, even if it's scary to do so.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought that was really, really powerful.
Well, and hopefully in the process, I saw him say that as well. He's on my list of people I'd love to have on this show, by the way. I might be reaching out to him soon. But yeah, Peter Boghossian is great, and what he's doing is great. And I think in doing so, he's implying that he doesn't want to waste any more time. I think that's really what he's saying, because he's been fighting this in essence for years, and many people have. But a lot of people have also been wasting time on growing their personal audience. I won't name any names, but there are some people that it turns into a little bit of a grift because it can be lucrative in very specific circumstances. And then there's people who have wasted time on just the meme about the intellectual dark web became it's conversations about conversations. And at first that was a good thing. At first it was like, you know what, in 2017 and to some extent 2018, that was really great. It was really great to see people have conversations about conversations. But eventually we came to the conclusion that free speech is good and woke supremacy is bad. And it seems like
where are we going from here?
Right. It's like, okay, now we need a goal, right? It's the same problem with Occupy Wall Street and any movement where there's no clear goal, which should probably in some way be able to be turned into legislation. Well, and actually, I got to give a shout out to Chris Rufo, another person I want to have on the show, because he's been actually taking it into state houses all across the country.
Critical ideologies in schools.
Yes. And having goals, having real goals. So Christopher Rufo and Peter Boghossian, I'm sure they've talked, but here are people who are doing something that I think you and I are sort of getting at, which is really fighting in a very direct way and not just having conversations in nice rooms. It's coming up with, and this is kind of a pattern on my channel that I always try to bring up in the podcast, and I'm glad we're discussing it now, obviously, is talking about what to do, what actions do we take now, because the conversations about conversations are really interesting and they can be very informative, but at a certain point we need to do what they're doing, which is acting, because we're kind of behind. It's like their horse left the gate a long time ago. We've got a lot of catch up to do
for so long.
Yes.
And they'll even have like ready-made activist posters and stuff like that communicate the tenets of their ideology, like queer theory, to people around the world.
Yeah.
And they'll have those ready, and when a certain event happens or some important thing happens where they can relate it, they just post it and it just blows up,
Yeah.
They're always planning, always making things.
And we need to take some plays out of their playbook. I always say that look, our ideas need to be better. Our tactics at the end of the day need to be a little bit more tethered to the truth, right? It's like there are things that need to be different, but we also need to use
of our value system and
yes,
the things that we want to move towards.
right. The core values are different, but some of the tactics actually need to be the same. I've brought up how leaving emotional appeal out of this completely because we don't like emotional appeal, it's not logical, is such a massive error. I totally one of my college degrees, I was a major in political science, public relations. The public relations aspect of this is so important. And I always bring up I've been thinking about this lately. You know what I recall, Zach, as the last real public relations victory for the intellectual dark web / heterodox coalition? It was do you want to guess what it was? I wonder if you'll know it. You don't have to.
No, I can't.
Yeah, I'll say it's a very long time ago. The last time I remember going, that's a win. That is a hard win for the intellectual dark web, for the heterodox coalition. It was Jordan Peterson on Channel 4 News or whatever it was with Kathy Newell. It was Jordan Peterson. That was such a win. 30 million people saw it, and it was a blowout. It made a lot of people, because a lot of people watch that and they say, I identify with him, not her. I am on that guy's side.
Totally.
Not
the beauty of it was he didn't just keep his cool the whole time, where she was misinterpreting everything he said. He kept his cool, but he also turned it around on her and made emotional appeals back to her, where she was like asking about, why does your freedom of speech trump a trans person's right to not be offended? And he basically said, well, you're risking offending me right now during this interview. Why does your right to offend me, trump my right not to be offended and stuff like that?
Yeah.
He flipped it back on her and is trying to force her to think through her own claims that way in an
appeal.
emotional appeal.
Well, and there was an optics aspect to it. I mean, the optics really were there are so few opportunities to make this happen. The optics were so good for him and so bad for them.
She was kind of up here, like on the attack, and he was kind of back here with his arms and then his legs crossed, and he was just very, very so precise, so calm, and though that contrast was immensely powerful. I totally agree. That was a huge win.
I bring it up because I've been asking, how do we replicate that instance over and over and over again? That was such an important moment. And of course, that was January 2018. Jordan Peterson owned the year 2018. I always talk about 2018 was the year of Peterson. That was when the book came out.
Yeah, the book came out.
And because that's what he was promoting. Yes. So that was the year of Peterson. That was a big moment for society. I don't think people, I cannot overstate how big of a moment that was when that came out. And there's no wonder, I think it has 30 or 40 million views on YouTube, more than your typical, intellectual dark web video or whatever you want to say.
Far.
So I bring that up because it's like, there's actually hope, I believe, because if we could do that once, we could hypothetically do it again. And
I think we should use how would you say maybe if you bullet pointed some main things, what would you say that would be important for our tactics?
Yeah, there needs to be an element of making people want to identify with your group over the other group. There needs to be an element of giving people a picture that is like the picture of the woman screaming at the black girl and the National Guard trying to get her safely into her school. There needs to be some kind of setup of, look, do you want to be with these guys or these guys? You need to give people a choice, and the choice needs to be pretty obvious, and you can base it off of real values that are better.
Right.
But at the end of the day, there is, I don't want to say there's a deceptive element, but there's a marketing element. Peterson did some really good, whether he did it on purpose or not, he did some great marketing. And remember, he was there to promote a book. He did some great marketing. He's
always been focused on entrepreneurship and business too. He's worked closely with business people. So he has a really good understanding of
think of it. We have the capitalists on our side. We have all the marketing. It's the people who think in these ways. It's like, I'm glad you asked me to kind of elaborate on my position, because I know it's a little vague, but I just think that there needs to be also an element of, I know this is such, marketing PR brain, but there needs to be an element of cool. They're really good at making these things into fashion trends. So the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, Black Square on Instagram thing was a really cool fashion trend that you could use to show people how cool you are. Seriously, it's fashion. And you know who you can tell is doing the cool thing? If young white liberal women are doing it, that means it's the cool thing to do for the most part, right? Young white liberal, college educated, women. And so it's like, we can use that group as a case study. It's like, what's our Black Square on Instagram? There needs to be something like that, whether it's a thing that says, I am part of the free thinking coalition or the heterodox coalition. A friend of mine brought up a really interesting point. I'll give him a shout out, Ryan Lazarus. He used to work at Subverse, really cool guy. He had a point of like, what if you had something like cancel guard or cancel guardian on your social media profiles that said, if you are in the process of being canceled, you can come to me and my network for help. That some kind of safety net thing that you signal.
That kind of reminds me of a Counterpoint by Helen Pluckrose, their organization, which is helping people who are, let's say, seeing critical social justice ideologies getting infused into their institutions, their businesses, stuff like that, going to that organization for help, and they would fight for them, both legally and just giving them advice and consultation and stuff like that. And it's marketed so well too. It also reminds me, like, when I first wanted to start doing videos on sex and also gender, I wanted it to look cool too. I wanted it to have an aesthetic that was very easily recognizable, digestible for people, and something that people enjoyed watching just visually. And I think that's so important, because so many things, I feel like on our side, graphically just are not that great. Things that are spread around, and I've seen some of James Lindsay's graphics that he's made when he's compared like anti-racism to liberalism and things like that. Some of the graphics are actually pretty good. It's like we have to make things that are cool looking, that are easily shared, and break down the points into something simple. I recently posted a little poster called Principles of the Sex Binary. And I did it in an infographic style, where I have kind of a dark gray background and then 4 big points, and they're big letters or big numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then in red, kind of the like 2 words describing each point, and then in white text describing a little like full description of each point. And it's really short, really digestible, and people notice it immediately because of the color scheme and the way it's organized. And so it's been shared a lot too. And so I think that's like such an important strategy. And your second point about, I think your second point was about focusing on, was it having an overarching goal or plan maybe, or
that was part of what I was saying.
To be like making sure to include
making sure
people.
There's distinct groups that are being identified. I mean, at the end of the day, kind of a in-group, out-group dynamic of you're either a free thinker or you're part of the mob, which at the end of the day, I think is completely true. I don't think it's deceptive to say that right now, the way that this thing is going, you can be a part of just kind of the zombie horde, or you can be a free thinker.
See, we can look cool in the sense that look over here.
This is everybody getting a look into the marketing meeting for the intellectual.
That's right. We can look over here and be like, these people over here, we're the cool ones because we allow diversity of opinions.
Yeah, and it's true. Like that's the thing at the end of the day is that,
and look at these people over here. They are completely divisive. They're often really hateful people, and they are trying to make everybody conform. They're painting themselves as the liberals, as like the true liberals from the civil rights era, but they're not at all. These over here, these people, we are the true liberals from the civil rights era, wanting to open up dialogue, wanting to also protect people's rights at the same time, and wanting open inquiry and free thought like that. And I think that's way cooler. It's way better.
The conformity aspect is an important part of it. It's like you want to be the non-conformist group, but you also want to sort of imply that you can be a part of this group, right? Like we're a group you can be a part of, but we're the sort of non-conformist kind of rebellious faction in this battle.
And we have people from all walks of life, all types of people, all types of political perspectives, trans people, people who are born with intersex conditions, people who are Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, every type of person you could think of in terms of just surface level characteristics. Like, we have that diversity too.
Well, because that opens it up for people who identify with those people for whatever reason, because they're Black, because they're a woman, because they're trans, to say, oh, actually, there's some examples of people not thinking the way that I'm told I have to think despite this. And I think that, when we say some of these things, something that keeps going through my mind is like, there's going to be people in the heterodox coalition who are like, I don't like this because it's marketing, and it's isn't it just the same thing with the diversity and that? And it's like, no, I mean, it's, if you do it a little differently, if you use some of the same tactics, but your values are good and the information beneath your actions is actually true and well-intentioned, then it is different than what kind of the woke crowd does.
Because their diversity is rather superficial. Their diversity from the outward.
It's people who look different,
like
but all
diverse.
think the same.
Yeah,
whereas for us, it's like these people look different and also think differently.
But we have this overarching kind of value structure of, we value free thought, and we also want to keep dialogue open and stuff like that. And we don't want to force our belief system onto other people. So it's that type of belief system that overarches ours compared to the other side. Yeah.
All right. Well, the next time I have you on the show, Zach, we might make it just a big strategy session. I've actually been considering doing like a strategy session roundtable. Maybe we'll get Peter Boghossian on here. I'm going to be reaching out to him soon. He's on my list of people.
That would be so cool.
Yeah.
To have him on.
But
such great insight.
Yeah, I'm hopefully looking forward to hearing from him. It's some people, they don't respond to my emails. It's totally cool, but we'll see. I haven't reached out to him yet. But in any case, Zach, it was great speaking to you today. I know that you don't have all the time in the world, but I wanted to thank you for giving me your time. This was a really fantastic conversation. It's kind of a good example of what I like to do on this show. So before we sign off, I did want to ask if you have things you want to promote, your books, your social media, anything you want to talk about before we sign off.
Yeah, so on my social media, I mostly post about the reality of male and female and the evolutionary biology and the developmental biology of male and female. And I post a lot of citations, a lot of screenshots of peer-reviewed literature with the important parts highlighted, so you can read that too. And my Twitter is ZAE Lefty. And I've also written The Gender Paradox, which is a book that's listed on Amazon and Lulu and Barnes & Noble and other retailers, focusing on sex and gender and the things we've talked about. And then also I'm currently working on a book that I won't say the title of it yet because I'm still working on that, like nailing that down, making sure it's finalized. But I've been writing a few chapters so far and outlining it. And it's going to be focusing on debunking the sex spectrum, debunking the idea that male and female are socially constructed categories. So the whole focus throughout the book is that male and female are defined the same way across this vast diversity of life, and that through that we can understand the evolutionary biology of how the sexes originated, and then also the developmental biology of how the sexes then develop in individuals. And what I do is I take 12 major sex spectrum essays that are shared the most on social media, like Stop Using Phony Science to Justify Transphobia by Scientific American, like Sex Redefined by Nature, like The Five Sexes by Ann Fostow Sterling. I take all these essays and writings, and each chapter is debunking each of those essays and goes into detail of the sex spectrum strategies and the principles that they use in deconstructing their own deconstruction of sex.
That sounds great. Well, yeah, if you're interested in that, be sure to check out Zach's books, follow him on Twitter, and check out The Gender Paradox. Is that it on YouTube?
Yep.
Yes.
Check
out his YouTube channel.
And then Paradox Institute on YouTube.
Paradox Institute. Sorry, that's the YouTube channel. Check out Paradox Institute on YouTube and all of Zach's books. Thanks again for being on the show, Zach. This is the Veritas podcast. I'll see you all next time.